Hello everyone, my name is CraigTurner. I'm your host for today. We are here at this conference today honoring St. Joseph, the year of St. Joseph called for by Pope Francis. It's a beautiful conference. We've got about 4 hours of talks and other things happening today that will honor St. Joseph, and we can guarantee you some of this information that you get today you probably never heard before. So without further ado, I want to give a story first that ties in well with the entire conference and everything that we are doing here today. A personal story that happened in my own life. Back in 1994, I was married for only a year so far, and my wife had said, why don't we go out and visit relatives in Ohio? So I said, sure. So we made a visit to Eastern Ohio to visit her relatives, some of her aunts and uncles that she rarely gets a chance to see. We were living in Arlington, Virginia, so we were very close to Washington, D.C. And we made this trip out and found out that there was a place there called Servants of Mary Center for Peace. It was near Windsor, Ohio, and it was a place under construction, a Marian shrine under construction, with a statue that apparently was 50 feet tall of Our Lady of Guadalupe and some other things there too. So we decided we would make a day trip there. So when we went there, we ended up exiting the car, going toward the statue, and my wife stopped with our basic camera that we had, a family camera, held it up and snapped a photograph of the statue. Well, after our day there, we returned to the relatives and then back to Arlington, Virginia, and had our film developed. It was standard film. It was developed at a pharmacy, and we got the film back about maybe 2 weeks later. So when we were sitting at our kitchen table, we started going through the photographs, and I saw this particular photograph my wife had snapped and saw that in the sky there was an object hovering over the statue of Mary. Now, it was not an object that like an UFO. What I mean is there was some kind of object that was in the film, but it wasn't an imperfection like a dust particle on the lens. This was a real object, and it looked to us like a blue conical shape, like you might find with an ice cream cone, and then an orange thing over it. The orange was like a circle. For weeks we thought about this object. We couldn't figure out what it was, and eventually I came to the conclusion it must be a chalice with the Eucharist, and it was symbolic of Mary, the Mother of the Eucharist. The only problem with this idea was that an ice cream cone, when you put it on a table and you let go, it falls over. So the ice cream cone, the conical shape, didn't fit perfectly. It sort of was satisfactory, but it wasn't perfect. I sent the film away to a lab and had them make a very large 2-foot by 3-foot poster. And I got the poster back, and sure enough, the object now blown up on the poster board was much more clear and visible. And still, we had this same idea that it was some kind of symbolic image, but we couldn't figure out exactly what it was. So several years go by, and then we make another trip back out to visit her relatives in Ohio. So we're back in the same house we had stayed in before. It's evening time, and I have decided I'm going to go do prayer time in the bedroom. My wife is out in the living room. She is actually talking to her relatives. And I open up my Bible, and I just start hunting around a little bit. Now, all of a sudden, I turn to Isaiah. And in Isaiah 62, verse 1 goes like this: "For Zion's sake, I will not be silent. For Jerusalem's sake, I will not be quiet until her vindication shines forth like the dawn and her victory like a burning torch." And I realized the image in the picture was a torch. And so I got up from my place. I went over to my wife, who was in the midst of a conversation with her relatives, and I leaned over to her and I said, "I know what the image is in the sky over the Virgin Mary." I said, "It's a torch." And she sort of looks up at me and says, like, "Okay, dear, run along. Thank you very much." And so I go back into the bedroom and I'm praying, and I begin to think about, okay, so why would this be an image of a torch in the sky? So, of course, what comes to mind are many passages from the Bible. Moses has to lead the Jewish people. There's probably 600,000 of them leaving Egypt, and they go along the desert route. And it says in Exodus 13, "The Lord preceded them in the daytime by means of a column of cloud to show them the way, and at night by means of a column of fire to give them light." It says, "Neither the column of cloud by day nor the column of fire by night ever left its place in front of the people." I thought, wow, that's a stark image. Then we go on and we see Abraham. Of course, Abraham consummates the covenant with humanity, between humanity and God, by means of fire. What he does is he is asked to make a sacrifice of animals. They're split in two, laid out, and then a flaming torch, or some Bible translations call it a flaming brazier, it passes between the carcasses of the animals, and Abraham does the same, and that consummates the new covenant, the covenant with God. Then we have Pentecost. Of course, tongues of fire come down upon Mary and upon the apostles. And then we have, when we leave the Bible, we see many other images. St. Dominic's mother, while she was pregnant with him, had this dream. Of course, she didn't know she had a future saint, carrying a future saint. She had this dream that a hound leapt from her womb, and carrying in its mouth, it had a torch. She said that she saw the animal seem to set the earth on fire. And of course, St. Dominic was the propagator of the rosary. He was very Marian. Then we go all the way to the 20th century, and we find Our Lady of America. Now, Our Lady of America was the Virgin Mary appearing, apparently, allegedly, to Sister Mary Ephraim Nuzzel. And this happened in Fostoria, Ohio, very close to the place where we had taken this photograph. So Mary gives messages about the purity of the family and the purity of the body, how important it really is. One of the messages goes like this. It's given on the Feast of the Immaculate Heart. It's August 22nd, 1957. "I wish to gather about me, my tender child, soldiers and valiant bearers of the torch, an army of brave lovers who, as my torch-bearers, will rekindle the fire of divine love in the souls of men. Only those who are strong in love can become my soldiers, to bear aloft not the sword of destruction, but the sword of fire, the flaming torch of divine charity." It's a beautiful message. And then, following this, at one point, St. Michael the Archangel comes to Sister Mary, and he says to her, this is what she wrote. St. Michael came to me one evening, shortly after Our Lady's visit, holding an immense flaming torch. He held it toward me, saying, "My little sister, you must carry this torch through the world." He came again the next night in the same manner. The next day, I was interiorly enlightened during Mass. It was made known to me that those, particularly the youth, who are willing wholeheartedly to follow Our Lady in her great battle against evil, would bear the special title of torchbearers of the Queen. I want to tell you now that you are being called to be a torchbearer of the Queen. You here who are at this conference, all who are watching this, are called to this illustrious role. You have to be faithful, pure, holy, and chaste. And remember that Philippians 2:15 calls you to this very role, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Remember that ancient Greece had the Olympics, and the torchbearers carried their torches through the crowded streets. This was symbolized by the light of divine truth, and our mission is to transmit divine truth to the people. So spiritual wisdom that is needed to guide humanity to God. You are being called to be a torchbearer, and we ask you that you, in prayer, you ask the Blessed Mother Mary, the Queen of Heaven, whether you can be a torchbearer. Don't look at the reward that you would receive for this role, although it may be immense. Simply think about how grateful you are to being called to sacrifice and to serve the Queen. So we turn now to the greatest evil that humanity had ever faced. Mary is going to be the one who intercedes for us in order to eliminate this evil. The subject of this first talk for today is the rise of this grave evil. It is 1843. It's in Tours, France. And the name of our hero for this portion is Sister Mary of St. Peter. She is a nun and a Carmelite nun in Tours, France, and she begins to receive revelations from Jesus. They come both as locutions and sometimes as visions of Jesus. And in the first visit, Jesus tells her that she is to be always to honor Jesus and Mary together and to never separate the two. And then in the second visit, he gives her a new prayer called the Golden Arrow Prayer. The Golden Arrow Prayer is to be recited. Jesus says that it wounds him with this arrow of love that places him in ecstasy, that it's so beautiful. And it's to appease God for the sin of blasphemy. And here's how the Golden Arrow Prayer goes. May the most holy, most sacred, most adorable, most incomprehensible and ineffable name of God be forever praised, blessed, loved, adored, and glorified in heaven, on earth, and under the earth by all the creatures of God and by the Sacred Heart of our Lord Jesus Christ in the most holy sacrament of the altar. This prayer is used by all the people who are to be torchbearers in order to give back to God the love that we owe Him. So we find that this beautiful prayer, the Golden Arrow Prayer, is a means of atoning for the sin of blasphemy. In this third visit, Jesus tells Sister Mary of St. Peter that she is to spread this devotion by means of the press. It's not supposed to be something that is just a personal devotion to her, or even something that the Carmelite convent would recite, let's say at evening prayers or something like that. But it's supposed to go out to all of France and ultimately the whole world. In the 8th visit, he gives her a vision of hell, reveals to her the tragedy of sin and what happens when people are unrepentant of their sins. Then on the 9th visit, Jesus tells her that it is both Sunday work and blasphemy that are the two grave sins that have angered God. Then in the 14th visit, Jesus tells her something. He says, "Oh, if you only knew what great merit you acquire by saying even once, 'Admirable is the name of God,' in the spirit of reparation for blasphemy." So when you think of this phrase, "admirable is the name of God," you think of it as possibly a compliment, but it's not really a strong compliment. When we think of the Golden Arrow Prayer, all these superlatives are being used to describe the name of God. So Jesus is saying that even if you say, "Admirable is the name of God," and you merit something great, imagine when you say the Golden Arrow Prayer, what kind of merit there is for that. So we go on and we find out that Jesus tells her she has to have courage and confidence. He tells her this on June 6th of 1944. It's exactly 98 years before the storming of Normandy and D-Day, the D-Day invasion. It's to the day and the hour in which mankind has to have courage and confidence in their battle against evil. Then Sister Mary of St. Peter is told she has to take this message to the Archbishop. The Archbishop has to spread this devotion throughout France. She does so, and the Archbishop meets with her, and she has an interview. He's very enlightened by her and finds her to be very holy and very devout. And he writes up a pamphlet with the Golden Arrow Prayer in it, and then distributes it, but then there is a backlash. Really, the backlash comes from the evil side trying to stop this great work of reparation, and he recalls the pamphlets and then closes the case completely and says he doesn't want this work to be spread about. But in the meantime, the 19th visit by Jesus to Sister Mary of St. Peter, he reveals to her that his holy face is to be the object of adoration for this work of reparation. So now we have two things. One is words, and the other is an image, the image of Jesus' face. The holy face is actually he doesn't give her something to draw. It's any image of Jesus crucified. So there's many different images of Jesus crucified where he has a crown of thorns, for example. And so it is the holy face of Jesus, along with the golden arrow prayer, which are to be these means of making reparation to God. So then he says to her that the herd of blasphemers is under the power of the prince of darkness. And he also says, she says, our Lord made known to me that in sharing his pains, dividing them between us two, as it were, he felt greatly relieved, so that his servants will have to suffer for the work that they do for him. But in the meantime, we relieve the sufferings of Jesus by being faithful to him and by suffering in union with him. Finally, in the 28th visit, Jesus tells her that this work has to be approved by Rome itself, by the Vatican. And at that point, Sister Mary of St. Peter realizes this work is too great for me. She's a Carmelite nun, she's cloistered, there's no way that she can get to Rome. And so what she does is she calls out to the Blessed Mother and says, would you please go and appear to someone else in the world who can actually carry out this message and the devotion? So not long after that, it's a matter of weeks, and suddenly in France, still in France, in the Alps of France, close to a place called La Salette, Mary appears to two shepherd children. The date is September 19th of 1846. Maximin is a young boy. He's about 11 years old. He's unschooled. He knows almost no religion whatsoever, and he can't read or write. And then Melanie, who is almost age 14, she's also a shepherd child. The two of them are not related. They've just been put together and assigned to take some sheep and some animals out to pasture. And the two of them have their animals out for pasture in the mountains. Beautiful, beautiful place, actually. It's the most beautiful place that I've ever seen. Close to La Salette, France. And suddenly, a globe of brilliant light comes down from the sky. They think it's brighter than the sun, and it rests upon a rock. It engulfs this rock, and it is dazzling. And then the globe of light dissipates and disappears, and within the globe is a woman who's sitting on the rock. She has her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands, and she's sobbing. She's decked in a beautiful gown. She has roses in various places. She's wearing a crown on her head. The two of them are terrified. Melanie drops her stick, and then Maximin says for her to keep her stick. He says, if she comes close, I'll give it a good whack. And then the woman stands up, and she says in a very beautiful tone of voice and very calming, she says, come to me, my children. Do not be afraid. I am here to tell something of the greatest importance. Now, some translations of the French into the English say, I have great news. That's actually kind of a bad translation, because what she was saying was not that I have good news to tell you. She was saying, I have very important news. She says, I have news or something to tell you of the greatest importance. She then goes on and she says exactly the same things that were being told to Sister Mary of St. Peter. Most people don't know the connection between Sister Mary of St. Peter and La Salette, France. But she goes on and she says, Mary says that it is Sunday work and then blasphemy that are the two grave sins that have angered God. She goes on and she says that if the harvest is spoiled, it's your own fault. She mentions the potatoes and says that the potatoes will rot, and by Christmas they will have none left. And then she gives a prophecy. She says, a great famine is coming. She says, grown-ups will pay for their sins by their hunger. She says, however, if the people are converted, the rocks will become piles of wheat, and it will be found that the potatoes have sown themselves. She's making the connection that sin itself brings about the evils in our world and creates the disasters that we see around us. But that if the people are converted, the reverse happens. And we find that we have a superabundance of all the good things that we need, including food. She then goes on and she says, and she's going back to the sins of the people, because she wants everyone to know exactly what the sins are that God has angered God. Only a few rather old women go to Mass in the summer. All the rest work every Sunday throughout the summer. And in winter, when they don't know what to do with themselves, they go to Mass only to poke fun at religion. So when she is finished, she begins to leave, and she gracefully, sort of delicately steps over a stream. And as she's walking away, they notice that the grass isn't even bent as she walks on top of it. And then she rises in the air and continues and says, "My children, you will make this known to all my people." That was the request of Sister Mary of St. Peter. Give this message to someone else who can take it to the proper people, who can then deliver the message and convert the people. Mary continues to walk away, and she says a second time, "My children, you will make this known to all my people." And she heads in the direction of the southeast, which is the direction of Rome. So the two children go back to the village. They tell their story. The people bring in the most devout of the villagers, and they end up deciding they're telling the truth. Neither one of these children was schooled in any way, and it was impossible for them to make up something that was so very Marian in its content. They take it to the priest. The parish priest the next morning boldly says that two of the children have now seen the Virgin Mary, and everyone must convert or terrible disasters will come. Well, it turns out that the parish priest was exactly right, but the devotion itself was not spread. And following this, within the next 12 months, there would be this tremendous famine. More than 1 million people would die of starvation. In Ireland, where the potato famine happened, which was the following year, there were more than 1 million people just there who died of starvation. The 3 crops that Mary mentioned in her prophecy all failed, and the people suffered through tremendous hunger. So we go back to Sister Mary of St. Peter, because Jesus is not finished. He's continuing to appear and to speak to Sister Mary of St. Peter, and now the tone begins to shift, because something very, very dramatic is going to happen. In 1846, on the 29th such communication that Jesus has with Sister Mary of St. Peter, he warns her of an approaching storm, what he refers to as the malice of revolutionary men. The following year, on March 14th, he speaks again to her interiorly, this time stating that a society known as the Communists was working secretly to spread through society. She had never heard this word before. She didn't even really know what to make of it. He says, "Oh, if you only knew their secret and diabolical plots and their anti-Christian principles." So as a cloistered nun, of course, there was very little that she knew about what was happening in society. But at the same time, Jesus says that to destroy her work, they would use the golden arrow prayer and then the devotion to the holy face of Jesus. On March 29th, 1847, and again 3 days later on April 1st, Jesus warns of the grave danger this group poses for humanity. He describes them as enemies of the church and of her Christ. Twice he refers to them as formidable. And he ominously states the following year, the storm is already rumbling. So Sister Mary of St. Peter has met with the Archbishop once. He did print the Golden Arrow prayer, but then retracted it after he found that there was resistance. Now she's requesting that she meet with him again. On the 47th encounter with Jesus, Sister Mary of St. Peter records that Jesus says, "Pray, pray, for the church is threatened by a fearful tempest." He names both communism and atheism as the greatest of these enemies. Then on the 50th encounter, he demands under no uncertain terms that either the Archbishop or his secretary visit the nun to hear about the impending tempest and the divine remedy that he is giving to humanity. She makes this known to her superior, and 2 weeks later, the Archbishop's secretary arrives for a visit. Now, the message that is being carried by Sister Mary of St. Peter is spelled out in this wonderful book. It's called The Golden Arrow. And it tells the story of Sister Mary of St. Peter and what the work is that she did, and actually the different encounters that she had. So this interview with the Archbishop's secretary is captured in the Golden Arrow book. And in it we find that the Archbishop's secretary listens to her carefully. She tells of how desperate Jesus is that this devotion gets started because there's a grave evil that's going to affect humanity if it's not carried out. And then he says to her, there is nothing to attest to the validity of your mission. And he says to her, don't bother the Archbishop any longer. She's devastated, but she's willing to be obedient, and she says that she will follow what she's being told to do. So he leaves, and less than 2 weeks later, Jesus appears again to her. This time he's radiant with light and shining in glory. It's the resurrected Jesus. And he states that her mission on earth is now complete, and she will soon die. You will soon behold my face in heaven, he says. She's in good health, but she accepts this revelation. She tells her superior. And then shortly after this final visit, Sister Mary of St. Peter develops pulmonary tuberculosis, and on July 8th, 1848, she dies at the young age of about 32. So at the same time that Jesus is appearing to Sister Mary of St. Peter, there's an unknown political theorist living in Brussels, Belgium, who's writing the Communist Manifesto. His name is Karl Marx. His financier, the person who's financing him, is Friedrich Engels. And the two of them have been commissioned by this little splinter group that resides in London to write a tract that they can use explaining what communism is. So they are living in Brussels, Belgium, write the Communist Manifesto at the same time that Jesus is appearing to Sister Mary of St. Peter, trying to tell the Archbishop that there's a grave evil that is going to descend upon humanity if the mankind doesn't follow the instructions that he's giving. In January of 1848, they take this document to London and they present it to the group, and the group reads it and says, wow, this actually is better than we thought it was going to be. And in the following month, February of 1848, they publish the Communist Manifesto. So just shortly after the Communist Manifesto was published, an unexplainable wave of revolutions sweeps Europe. It's actually the largest wave of revolutions in history. While social scientists today admit to not understanding the causes of the revolutions of 1848, the genesis is nevertheless clearly obvious. They were a symptom of a greater evil that had now been unbridled like a giant dragon. Karl Marx, the father of modern communism, had unleashed his disease upon the world. I looked up the revolutions of 1848 in my Encyclopedia Britannica, and it clearly states in there that even today, no one knows what happened. But we know that when a spiritual evil is unleashed, there are physical repercussions in our world. And so these physical repercussions happen with weather, with plants and animals. They happen with diseases. They also happen with economies. They happen with governments. And it affects all of our world. So the Communist Manifesto is about 50 pages long, give or take. It depends upon how many, what the size type is that you use and things like that. But it's somewhat melodramatic, and I would call it not very good writing. But that's just me. That's just me. Back in that day, it's possible this was very typical writing for people who were trying to write tracts in order to get people's attention. It was written for people to hand out and say, this is what we believe, and then explain in somewhat, more euphemistic terms what it was that communists believed in. The errors of communism are actually not really readily apparent. However, they do say in the document that they would call upon the violent overthrow of the ruling class and the stealing of their property if necessary, and this shows a tendency, obviously, toward violence and oppression. It begins melodramatically like this. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. And it outlines through 4 chapters a theory that all historical developments are the result of one economic class of people exploiting another. So in order to arrest this development and arrive at the final stage of human development, it says that we have to overthrow violently, if necessary, the ruling class appropriate their property, and establish a communist state devoid of any private ownership. So communist states openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. And that's the ending of the Communist Manifesto. Well, it's quickly published in other languages, including English, French, and Russian, but it doesn't seem to make much traction. And in the meantime, Karl Marx continues to try to promote these theories that he's got. So let's take just a moment to look at Karl Marx, who he was, what kind of a life he lived. Very few people actually have studied his life and know about his life very well. We can turn to a Prussian police report. He was followed from time to time. Though he wasn't famous during his lifetime, he was followed by the police because they knew he was somewhat of an anarchist and also a revolutionary, and he was deemed to be dangerous to the state in one way or another. The Prussian police report from 1853, by this point in time he's living in London, goes like this. In his private life, he is highly disorderly and a bad manager. He lives the life of a gypsy, of an intellectual bohemian. Washing, combing, and changing his linen are things he does rarely. He likes to get drunk. He is often idle for days on end, but when he has work to do, he will work day and night with tireless endurance. For him, there is no such thing as a fixed time for sleeping and working. He will often stay up the whole night and then lie down on the sofa, fully dressed around midday, and sleep until evening, untroubled by the fact that the whole world comes and goes through his room. It goes on by saying, Marx lives in one of the worst and therefore one of the cheapest quarters of London. There is not one clean and solid piece of furniture to be found in the whole apartment. Everything is broken, tattered and torn. Everywhere, too, the greatest disorder. Manuscripts, books and newspapers, the children's toys, his wife's mending and patching, together with several cups with chipped rims, dirty spoons, etc. It goes on and concludes by calling him wild and restless. So at the same time, right at the same time, an amazing thing happens at the Vatican. So there's turmoil in different parts of Europe and in the world. And the Pope, in order to foster devotion among the people, has asked that in St. Peter's they bring out two very important relics for veneration for 3 days. One of the relics is a piece of the true cross. The other one is the Veil of Veronica. Now, as Jesus was carrying the cross through the streets of Jerusalem, a woman who had a veil. The veil, actually, we think of a veil as a small piece like this. In the modern times, in those times, it was more like a shoulder shawl, a little bit bigger, and oftentimes the women had them on their shoulders. They could use it like this for modesty, or they could take it off and clean the wounds of a beggar, for example, something like that. So the Veil of Veronica is also kept at the Vatican. These two items were brought out for veneration. And then on the third day, something amazing happens. Now, I want to tell you, first of all, that the Veil of Veronica, because it is so old, the image of the face of Jesus is hard to discern at this point. Back 2,000 years ago, they would have seen it, because when she wiped the face of Jesus, miraculously the image of the face of Jesus, sort of like the Shroud of Turin, appeared on this piece of cloth. But over the many, many centuries, it has since faded until this particular day, or there's been a couple of other times when suddenly the face of Jesus appears on the cloth again. The people noticed it. The canons who were part of the clergy saw this and came, and they rang the bells of St. Peter's. People came in from the streets, and there was for 3 hours this amazing event when people could see the face of Jesus on the veil. There was also a soft light that seemed to illuminate the veil itself, and then the priests of the Vatican called a notary to come in and make documentation of the fact that this had happened. So this happened along with, and the reason we bring this up is because we see that the face of Jesus is part of the devotion that is necessary in order to fight this grave evil that we're talking about, this evil called communism, which so far is still a splinter group. And if it's destroyed at its roots before it even can grow and blossom, then all the better. There was also a man, he was a layperson, his name was Dupont. He was given an image of the face of Jesus that had been touched to the Veil of Veronica. He hung it in his home and put a candle with some oil next to it to burn, and he found out that as he prayed over with the oil from the lamp, people were healed. And in the end, thousands of people were healed by this man. He was called by one pope possibly the greatest healer in Christian history. So anyway, I want to mention before I go on with my story that we have today from the 20th century the Divine Mercy image. And it's possible, it's worth considering, that the Divine Mercy image came about, it was given to St. Faustina because the Holy Face devotion fell away and was never really properly promoted. So we have the Divine Mercy image, which would be the full body of Jesus showing the rays of red and pale, but the face of Jesus as well. And it took a pope to come and actually usher this devotion in and protect it and actually bring it all the way to fruition so that the image itself could become part of all of Catholic devotion. Okay, so we're going to jump into another saint. This time it is a saint that very few people know about. And he's a very important saint, sort of a superstar. He's kind of a rock star of the saints. And his name is Anthony Mary Claret. If you're from Cuba or you're listening to this in Cuba, you know exactly who he is. And if you're from Spain, it's very possible you know who he is. He was a Spaniard who was born in the northeastern region of Spain and actually became a weaver. He was a weaver for quite a while, became very skilled as a weaver. But then there was this call, an interior call that became very strong, and he decided to join a religious order. There were a couple of religious orders that he was interested in, but he ended up as a diocesan priest and then was sent out on missions. And his work was tremendous. They saw that they had somebody in their hands who was tireless, had tremendous energy, and actually had incredible charisms. He was sent off to become the Archbishop of Cuba. The reason is because Cuba had fallen into real disarray. The people were, men and women were living together without getting married. Imagine that. There was the clergy was struggling, and actually the whole place was just a kind of a real mess. So he's sent off to be the Archbishop of Cuba. I want to tell you before, just to give you a background to understand who he was and what kind of a person that we're dealing with. Some of his charisms. His body would become transfigured while preaching or in prayer. People would see this with their own eyes. He would levitate up to 6 feet off the ground, at times in front of credible witnesses. He stopped a series of earthquakes in Cuba by kneeling on the ground and placing his palms to the earth while uttering prayers. He could calm terrible storms by raising his hand to the clouds, blessing the clouds, and the clouds would dissipate and the storm disappear, just like Jesus on the Sea of Galilee. He experienced both apparitions of Jesus and Mary, and he was even seen walking on water. In addition, a supernatural light that radiated from his body while he was saying Mass was seen by many people. It was so intense at times that one witness said he saw the light radiate from his body behind the altar all the way to the sacristy. Queen Isabella of Spain, this is a different Queen Isabella from 1492, we're talking about the 1800s here. Queen Isabella of Spain even produced a written statement solemnly declaring that she had personally witnessed this phenomenon. So he's a major saint. Well, among the many other gifts that are not listed here was the gift of interlocution. He would hear Jesus sometimes, and he would hear Mary speak to him. Both Jesus and Mary would speak to him interiorly with words, and so on September 3rd of 1859, Anthony Mary Claret heard Jesus tell him that there were 3 great evils that were descending upon mankind. The first was a series of enormous, horrifying wars. Well, those would come about during the 20th century. The second, he called the four powerful demons of pleasure, love of money, false reasoning, and a will separated from God, that is, human will over divine will. And then finally, he said that the third chastisement would be brought about by communism, a movement that he had never heard before. So we find that Anthony Mary Claret went off and tried to preach that there were these grave evils that were coming. And in the meantime, it's very important to step back and look at the communists and their movement, because few people understand or know that they hadn't adopted the name communists yet, or communism. They had different names for their group all the way through many decades. They called themselves the League of the Just. Doesn't sound like a very threatening group there, does it? Or First International. And then First International then became Second International. Then they had the International Working Men's Association. That was another name for their group. They called themselves the Communist Corresponding Committee, and other names. But God, who is able to see the future, saw that they would end up with the name communists, and was telling the saints ahead of time, this little tiny group, almost invisible to you at this time, will eventually be the group that causes the gravest evil to humanity. So St. Anthony began to preach against these evils, but only a month later an assassin attempted to take his life. The man leapt at him with a knife out on the street, tried to plunge the knife into his skull, missed and scraped down his face. The man was subdued, the knife taken from him, and then sobbing, he confessed his sin and basically repented of everything that he had done. And St. Anthony Mary Claret forgave him on the spot. He was, 2 years later after this, first warning, it was during benediction of the Blessed Sacrament, August of 1861. St. Anthony is again warned interiorly by Jesus that communism is the great foe of humanity. The remedy, he told him, would include devotion to the Blessed Sacrament and the Rosary. Devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, Jesus; the Rosary, Mary. It's interesting that most people think of communism as 1917. That's when communism sort of blossoms. But we're talking 1861, is long before. One of the most interesting prophecies given by St. Anthony came in the 1850s when he was traveling by horseback to preach in the mountainous region of Cuba known as the Sierra Maestra. Here, he said, the Virgin Mary appeared to him and told him that in the future a bearded man wearing a uniform and bearing weapons would arise in Cuba from those same mountains. He would at first be called a hero because of the reforms he would promise to the people. But ultimately, he would rule the island for 4 decades with an iron fist, causing great hardship for many. 100 years later, the prophecy came true. In the 1950s, Fidel Castro and 19 companions established their guerrilla base in the same region that St. Anthony saw the Virgin Mary while riding his horse. When he came to power after overthrowing the government, he was at first hailed as a hero, but he would ultimately take away the freedoms from the people and rule the island as the only communist dictator in the Western Hemisphere for 4 decades before succumbing to poor health. It was exactly as Mary had predicted. So we find that St. Anthony was a man of clear mind, incredible charisms. He went on to write 140 books. He preached about 250,000 sermons. And then 27 years after his death, his tomb was opened and his body found to be incorrupt, not having decayed over the course of more than 2.5 decades. So in 1883, Karl Marx dies. His movement is still a fledgling movement, but just having been buried, Friedrich Engels is standing over his grave, and he declares Karl Marx to be the greatest thinker of their age. So the following year after Marx dies, an amazing event happens at the Vatican. It is Pope Leo XIII. Pope Leo XIII has just had a vision in which he has seen or heard Jesus and the devil in conversation. He's knocked to the floor, and as he's lifting himself up, he hears Jesus and the devil speaking to each other. He hears in a raspy voice that the devil says he can take over the world and boast that he will have ultimate victory, but first he needs more time and more power. Jesus, in this pleasant tone, says, "How much time and how much power?" The devil says, 75 to 100 years, and more power to those who have given themselves over to my service. Though he's reluctant to subject his people to such a severe test, Jesus grants the request. So immediately after this moment, Pope Leo XIII gets up and he retires to his chamber, and he writes a famous prayer, the St. Michael prayer that we say each day after Mass. And this prayer is to be used in exorcisms. And it's the prayer that Pope Leo XIII hopes will protect humanity. So I pass on now this wonderful story and what more we have to learn to Father Chris, who is going to take it from here. Go ahead, Father Chris.